Primobolan is almost an essential part of safer use anabolic cycles. It's been a staple within my anabolic stacks for years now, and it's something that I've grown to love and treasure over all other compounds. But the dissenting voices still exist, with JP and Victor Black having Instagram feuds about how much Primo is enough to do the job. I sat back and contemplated my position. Have I seen massive differences between, say, 400 milligrams of Primo and 700? The top line of what I'd done before? Well, yes, I'm confident in saying that I saw a notable difference in fullness, in mood. But what happens when you push that compound to the limits of safer use dosing? And is it technically still safer use, running it in those high doses? Well, don't worry, you don't need to go all Tony Huge playing doctor. That responsibility rests on my shoulders. And today I'm going to talk you through what I found out. So the progression of this cycle was quite simple to follow. I introduced Primo again at about 500 milligrams per week to start off with, alongside around 300 milligrams of testosterone and about 150 milligrams of NPP. I slowly titrated up the doses throughout the cycle, making small incremental increases in testosterone dose, then Primobolan dose, and eventually the NPP dose. Now, this cycle wasn't going to be the same as the ones I'd run before because, needless to say, this compound selection, these doses, are familiar territory for me. But this cycle was going to be slightly different because there were going to be two experiments I was running during this 16 to 18 week cycle. And those were firstly the introduction of Trenbolone, which we talked about here, and the second of which was to test quite what the limit is of Primobolan. How much can you run and still classify it as a safer use cycle? Do the effects increase incrementally? Is there a cause and effect between dosage and progress? And how would I feel pushing the dosing envelope of a compound that I've never quite felt anything from before in terms of effects on lifestyle detrimentally, or mental state, or any of those negative things that you can get from, I don't know, say Tren. So around 12 weeks into the cycle, we made two vital changes, the introduction of the Trenbolone, and we pushed Primobolan above our previous high. We went to around 850, then 900, and we settled on a gram. 900 just doesn't have the same ring to it. For transparency, the other compound dosages while I was running a gram of Primo per week, God, that sounds good, doesn't it? Was 525 milligrams of testosterone enanthate and 125 milligrams of Tren A. And I introduced the Trenbolone around a week before the Primobolan. That would allow enough time for it to saturate slightly to feel the effects of the first couple of pins and be able to give a reasonable level of separation between the cause and effect of the two drugs. Now, it's not going to be watertight. There is going to be some bleeding through of delayed Trenbolone side effects into the Primobolan side effects, but Primobolan is an enanthate ester. It means it's a longer ester. It would take longer to get from the 800 to a gram than it would for Tren to saturate at the 125 milligram dose. The first thing that I will say about running a gram of Primo is that it's expensive. Now, I can see completely why the ROI debate within the bodybuilding community around Primobolan would be a contentious one. It is the most expensive anabolic steroid in my experience, not counting ancillaries like growth hormone, for example, and it is mild, and I mean in terms of negative side effects, but also in terms of anabolic gains, milligram per milligram that is, of course, not comparing safer use dosage ranges to safer use dosage ranges. Even at a gram a week, it was still only setting me back maybe £40 per week for Primobolan alone. So alongside cheaper anabolics like Test and Tren, and after removing growth hormone, it wasn't going to bankrupt me. It's not actually that bad, and realistically, if you have a tough time deciding whether or not to spend £40 per week on your anabolics to have one of the safest compound around at a massive dose, then you've got other problems. Now, I'm not saying that I recommend this to anyone. I absolutely don't. I'm not a doctor. This is not advice. However, still the point stands that investment in bodybuilding and doing it the right way should never be a question. If you can't afford to do things the right way, you can't afford to do them at all. I don't mean you have to run a gram of Primo every time. I just mean that, for example, if your excuse to run a fuck ton of Tren is that you can't afford to add in safer compounds like Primobolan or even Masteron, then you've got a problem in your cycle design. But it is expensive nonetheless, I will give you that, and for a lot of people who tolerate something like a Masteron better, maybe the risk-reward ratio would be better for that compound. Would this stop me doing it again? Nah, definitely not. Maybe if we reintroduced growth hormone and that cost meant that the general anabolic stack cost me significantly more overall, because growth hormone does pretty much double the cost of your anabolic stack, then yeah, maybe Primo dose would be lowered to account for that, but on its own, without those other factors, it's not really that much of a big deal. Did I notice significantly more muscle gain? No. I'm sorry guys, look, there is not a direct cause and effect between dosage and progress. A lot of the other factors still need to be perfectly in line for you to gain a progressive rate once you're above your last previous record. So for example, I ended my off season 210 pounds previously. I then came back at an improved 210 pounds, and pushing to 230 has been significantly challenging. And most of the time that I've been running a gram of Primo, I've been above 220, going up to 225, 226 at the minute. I've nudged 229 at times, but still it's been elusive. And nothing I do to dosing is going to change that. That's down to digestion, that's down to appetite, that's due to training intensity because I feel sluggish from the diet mostly. Have I felt any negative side effects from running the higher dosage? What about feel? What about health? Well, I can say no. My blood pressure has stayed relatively the same as running, say, 600 milligrams up to a gram. There hasn't really been any difference. Have I felt more on? Well, no, except for when I introduced Primobolan. Now that shit is a different story. We're yet to see where my health markers ended, and I will be doing a follow-up video on that. But I wanted to give you the anecdotal first before we look at the blood test results, because of the fact that Primobolan's been added and there's a lot of interpretation to be done with that. And if there are any changes, I'm going to have to step back and take things out to determine what caused any ill side effects in terms of health profiles. But I didn't feel much different. It's not a drug that you do to feel. If you want to feel like you're on cycle, run a couple of 100 milligrams of Tren. But high Primo running a gram and above, in my experience, is negligibly different. I feel like the benefits really top out about 700, and that's probably the sweet spot. But running it up to a gram, I've not felt enough to justify the fact that almost definitely it is less healthy to run a gram of Primo than it is to run 700 milligrams. The benefits just aren't there. And this is the benefit of being able to be brutally honest with yourself, not chasing an illusion, not allowing yourself to be absorbed by placebo, and being real. A lot of people don't try lower dose cycles in the first place. They go on the internet. They slate safer use protocols. They slate Primobolan, saying that anything below 700 milligrams ain't gonna do shit. And yet, they've never tried it themselves. And then you look to the bodybuilders who have changed their cycle approach, the people who have cemented their mass maybe with higher doses, sure, and then dropped down, which does skew things slightly, but still, they finally come to grips with the idea of safer dose protocols, and it's working for them. James Hollingshead has recently talked about how dropping down his dosages has benefited him and he's progressing more, likely due to a less amount of overall stress on the body, because more anabolics means more stress. Luke Sando famously benefited from dropping his dosages down. JP has come back on his phrasing that Primo under 700 milligrams won't do enough. Now, I'm with him with the fact that 400 probably ain't going to cut it in a competitive bodybuilding sphere either, but I'd say 600 to 700 is definitely the sweet spot, and you don't need to consider that a minimum. That's probably the maximum from my experience. If you're going to go into a competitive bodybuilding setting at the absolute highest level and can you afford it, would I then change my mind? Well, maybe I'd throw the extra couple of milligrams in there just because the level of competition was higher and there was more at risk. But much more likely, I would utilize better quality drugs, or implement a more elaborate growth hormone protocol, or bring that back in, or add more exotic peptides, which can enhance my progress without necessarily just piling more stress onto the same receptors. A gram of Primo worked, but not considerably more than 500 to 700 milligrams. So I'll be going back down in dosage for my next cycle. Experiment concluded, more drugs isn't always better. But I'm sure the same people who go on the internet without ever trying a lower dosage cycle, slating it, will come onto this video and say the same here. And that's absolutely fine. Bodybuilding is individual, anabolic response is individual. Different people need different levels of drugs, and this is why you should carefully and in a controlled way and still within a safer use framework, experiment. Try it. See how your body reacts. Be honest with yourself about the outcome, but don't say shit until you've done that. What's the highest that you've ever run Primobolan? Let me know down below, and I'll see you in the next one.